the Florida Mental Health Counselors Association webinar entitled To D or Not to D, Differentiating Between Post-Traumatic Stress and Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder with Dr. David Sanfilippo. This is the 9th webinar for our 2019 Emerging Issues in Mental Health Counseling webinar series. My name is Aaron Norton, and I am the chair of PHMCA's Education, Training Standards, and Continuing Education Committee and PHMCA's president. I'll be your moderator today. I'm going to ask you, the audience, a couple questions by launching a couple of our polling questions. Kind of take a pulse and see what we have out there today. Your first polling question is, which of the following describes you? And you can select more than one option if more than one applies. First option is a licensed mental health professional, such as an LMHC, LMFT, or LCSW, a registered intern, a counseling student, a counselor educator, or finally other. All right, I think we'll go and close this polling question out with 82% of you having responded and share our results. 71% of you are licensed professionals, 14% students, 14% counselor educators, 14% other, and 7% registered interns. Great. So we'll also launch a second polling question here, and this one's more about today's learning objectives. We'd like to know which of the following learning objectives you're most interested in hearing about. Option 1 is learn about the difference between post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. 2, explore a model for who can suffer from PTS versus PTSD. And 3rd, learn to prevent post-traumatic stress from becoming post-traumatic stress disorder. And we will close your polling question out and launch our results here. So 53% of you are interested in the difference between post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. 40% of you are interested in learning to prevent PTS from becoming PTSD. And finally, 7% of you are most interested in exploring a model for who can suffer from PTS versus PTSD. All right, so without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce today's presenter. Dr. David Sanfilippo is the chair of the graduate program in Health Services Administration for the College of Professional Studies and Advancement at National Louis University. He teaches courses in healthcare administration and management, consciousness studies, death, dying, bereavement, and near-death experiences. Dr. Sanfilippo earned his PhD in human science from Saybrook University. He's a licensed mental health counselor, a certified disability management specialist, and he serves as the clinical director of Blue Line Support, the service of the Wounded Officers Initiative. So, Dr. Sanfilippo, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our presenter.
Well, welcome all. Thank you for taking the time out to attend this webinar. I have a personal interest in this area with post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress injuries and post-traumatic stress disorder. As was announced in my introduction, I work with police officers. I work with police officers who have either been physically or mentally wounded in the line of duty and or are still in the line of duty but are suffering from post-traumatic stress of some type. I also have the privilege of working with military personnel who have encountered situations where they are suffering from post-traumatic stress and indeed, in some cases, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'll differentiate these as we go into the presentation itself. I will, in transparency, I am, as was said, I'm a licensed mental health counselor. I'm also a veteran from the Vietnam period. Saw a number of wounded during Vietnam, and then also was sent to the Middle East in 1973. Where our orders of, we were told not to engage the enemy, but to just sit tight, which resulted in a number of, instead of physical wounds like we saw in Vietnam, we began to see a tremendous amount of psychological wounds as a result of not being able to have a chance to fight back, but just having to sit and take whatever was coming through. And then as I started into my practice, I worked with a number of people who suffered from various kinds of trauma, obviously resulting in um, post-traumatic stress. I did a lot of crisis intervention, and then was asked to join the Wounded Officers Initiative and to begin the Blue Line Support, which is a peer-to-peer support program where we train police officers and law enforcement support personnel to be peers with their peer officers, to help them, to basically triage them, determine whether or not their situation, their current situation, requires the treatment of a mental health counselor, or does it need just support. And then we are developing a network of mental health counselors around the country that will be able to provide support to our wounded officers if they need any kind of mental health support. During this presentation, my intention is to show several videos. Some of it might be disturbing to some individuals, but it's meant to provide some insight into what police officers go through, which is, similar to what other people go through when they have a post-traumatic stress situation, a crisis situation. But for the purpose of this subject pool, to use a research term, I'm focusing on primarily with law enforcement. My goal for this presentation, see if I can get it to go, is, as the objective stated in this, is to learn and to be the differences between not only post-traumatic stress, but post-traumatic stress injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. There is a defined difference, and my long-term goal is to begin to have a conversation and to ultimately change the language and the approach, and perhaps at some point in time the billing codes, to allow for post-traumatic stress injury to be a code, to be a term that we use more often than post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'll get into some of whys as we move forward. I also wanted to explore the framework of references of how we can support individuals who suffer from this, and then identify approaches to working with people who have post-traumatic stress injuries. I saw what the polls were, so I'll try and stay focused on the areas. As we go through this and I show the videos, there will be I'll stop, and at that point in time, if the moderator would turn on the microphone, so if people have questions or want to comment on the videos, that would, I'd like to get your feedback. This is, in some ways, I'd like to have this a give and take. I'll do some of the talking, let you all do some of the talking, and back and forth that way, if it's okay with all of you. And if not, I'll do it anyway. So looking at post-traumatic stress, it's an anxiety disorder, as you all know. I'm speaking to colleagues here, so we know this, that it's an anxiety disorder. Whether it attributes to an actual disorder, it starts as a post-traumatic stress where it's an anxiety situation. And this, with a critical incident, the person is typically numb at first and later begin to show different types of depression, excessive irritability, guilt, nightmares, things of that nature. The difference here is that the post-traumatic stress disorder is really a psychiatric disorder that can occur, and is the same. It's based upon the post-traumatic stress situation that individuals have been into, but also have passed into a level where it is very disruptive in their lifestyle, and and therefore would be considered a disability and also a disorder. This comes from natural disasters, accidents, terrorist acts, combat, rape, death. I had someone I was talking to just the other day that was sharing with me the loss of a spouse, and she was exhibiting all of the symptomologies that we see with people who are dealing with post-traumatic stress. So the next thing I'm going to show is a video. We've tested this out to see if it'll work. Hopefully we will be able to show you this video without any difficulty. And as I said, this one may be a little disturbing. I'll share more about this individual after the video.
Signal 9413 Diamond Drive on Diamond Ridge Boulevard. Advise them that it was a child caller on the line. Possible she was from the parent. Mother is no longer 10-12 for the child. Mother's possibly still there. Trying to get to it. Back out with your left we're back now with an adult advising him with something. Signal 9413 Diamond Ridge Drive on Diamond Ridge Boulevard. Advise them that it was a child caller on the line. Alpha 350 possible she was from the parent. Mother is no longer 10-12 for the child.
Wait one, we seem to be having some difficulty here. If you just wait one, they finish.
Sounds like there are two versions of it playing simultaneously at different times.
Let me try that again, folks.
Signal 9413 Diamond Ridge Drive on Diamond Ridge Boulevard. Advise them that it was a child caller on the line. Possible she was from the parent. Mother is no longer 10-12 for the child. Mother's possibly still there. Trying to get to it. Back out with your left we're back now with an adult advising him with something. And more. Still getting more. Alpha 350 come. Alpha 350 come. Elevator need on oil. 357 come. Anything you want?
413 $350 and free pop-up at JP.
Help me, please. I need an ambulance, please. Please. I'm not. Please. Help me. Unit for 1018. Can you hear me? Unit for 1018. Can you hear me? Alpha 257, I can hear you. I have unit 1018 to an EMS. I need EMS bed. I'm shot in the arm. In the abdomen. I'm...
Stacy, this is Jimmy. Hang in there, okay? We're on our way to you, all right?
I don't think I'm gonna hit bed.
Where's the end thing?
413 Diamond Ridge Drive. He's in bed, 413. I next to the door. I think it's 415 in the garage. From next one in the garage. This floor, I need help, please.
Well, let's see, Stacy. Hang on, we're all there. Where's the sheriff, baby?
The sheriff's at 413. I'm in the garage.
So as you can see, this was a very traumatic situation. I'm going to open up this now for comments by the group or questions by the group. Are there any comments? Aaron, could you open up so other people, if they have any questions or comments, could say something?
Certainly. So far, nobody has put anything into the questions box, but folks feel free to type questions or comments into the questions box in response to the video clip that you've seen and to the audio that you've listened to. And if you prefer, you can also ask to be unmuted, and then I can unmute you and you can speak directly instead of me reading on your behalf.
Now, as we're waiting to see if there's any responses or questions, let me share with you. The reason I showed that video and for you to hear it is because this incident happened to Stacy. Stacy is doing well. When we send out the copy of the slides, there'll also be some information on the slides, as you can see from this slide. You know that Stacy now, she and her husband were in law enforcement, and when this incident happened, her husband went on FMLA in order to take care of her, and it took a long time for her to recover from her injuries. She and her husband are doing fine. They both now, she was medically retired from the Auburndale Police Department. He left the department he was working with, and they're now pursuing their own passion. They're out there. They're actually have a YouTube channel now and a Facebook that's called I'm Not Lost, I'm RVing. They decided that what they wanted to do with their life, at least now, is to move on and move into pursuing their passion, and to start their YouTube channel, where they, if you go to the YouTube channel, you'll find it, I think, entertaining. It shares with you their journey. It shares with you how one downsizes from a normal home into an RV, and in their case, even to a smaller RV after they had their first one, and how they live, how they're able to sustain themselves. Stacy, obviously being medically retired, has some income from that, but they also have to sustain other income. And as you think about this incident that has happened to her, you heard the voices of the other officers involved. So that when this incident happened, not only does it happen to her, but it's a ripple effect to a number of other people, the other officers that have to respond, the 911 operator who is having to deal with it and to also do the dispatching to other people. And the incidences of post-traumatic stress are different from each of those that are involved because of their involvement. We find, as we talk to the individuals who are working 911 lines and the dispatching lines, they often walk away and have to go home after the shift, and they never really know what the outcome is of the individual. They didn't know the outcome of what was going to happen with Stacy. They didn't have an outcome as to what happened with the shooter themselves. So they deal with a lot of question marks. So we're trying to find ways to mitigate some of those issues for them by being able to share this information. Now, close the loop so that officers have an opportunity to understand the full factors of what went on, because some thinking is to try to compartmentalize what's going on within a law enforcement issue, not only because there's some legal ramifications, but also trying to protect others. And sometimes the lack of knowledge doesn't help them very much. So this was an example of obviously a severe situation that resulted in an injury, a severe injury to an officer, and post-traumatic stress to other officers.
We did get a comment and a question.
Sure.
First, we have a comment from Demena, who said that video really gave me an idea of how intense it can be, or how intense it can get for a first responder. And then we also have a couple questions from Dwight, who says, by the way, hi Dwight, was the video from the officer's body cam, forensics officer, media, or civilian? And then there's a second question also.
Okay, was that Dwight Bain by chance?
It was.
Now I'm really nervous because Dwight Bain is he's preeminent in this area. So welcome, Dwight. Thanks for the questions. No, the body cam at that time when she was injured, she was not wearing her body cam. They really hadn't been distributed to everybody. So this was some post video that was coming from the crime scene techs.
Okay. And then there is also a second question he asked, and much secondary trauma occurs from the photographer who tracks these traumas. I guess that was more a comment.
Yes, the photographers, what we found in our working with police officers is that, we always think of the police officers, but we forget about the other people who are involved in a crime scene, the photographers, the technicians who are taking samples and identifying each of the things, and also the individuals who ultimately have to do the cleanup, because that's an aspect too. So, we don't, what you saw in this video and what you were hearing more than the video, part of the reason I wanted to share this also is we have a vision of what law enforcement is like based upon what we see in the movies and on television. This was a real situation. This was a real recording, and how it does have that ripple effect to everyone, and how it's important for us to be able to decompress individuals who are going through crisis situations, and in fact, not only to decompress them, but to do it in the right setting. Unfortunately, we find that sometimes after incidences like this, that the post-accident work, the crisis intervention that is done, sometimes depending on agencies, depending on the location, are done in large group activities, whereas we found it's more effective in the crisis intervention that our team in West Orange is doing, is trying to get a smaller groups, keeping the groups separated by leaving some of the command staff out of it, and letting the officers who are involved in the crime scene, individuals involved, be part of the group so that they can talk it out. And it's very interesting when you're talking with them, when you're doing these crisis intervention things with the police officer, that they'll start talking about, well, I didn't see that. All I saw was you came flying through, or the next thing I knew that we were tied up together, because in one of my more recent ones, they had to subdue an individual, and they wound up, everybody was trying to subdue because it was a very strong, large individual, and they were trying to bring him down, tasing him. And the officers wound up getting tangled up in the wires too. So, there's a lot of secondary activity that happens in a crisis situation that creates the post-traumatic stress. And also, one of the things you'll find working with law enforcement personnel is that they do have, as we do in the mental health field, have interesting humor and how they go about looking at these things. But sorry, that would be me. I apologize. I thought I had it turned off.
Speaking of interesting humor, that was good timing.
Yes. So Woody tells me to move on.
Dwight, by the way, said he agrees police fire and medical deal with horrors every day that would shock the general public, nothing like TV. And he also offered a virtual smiley face and said, we're all learning from each other. And that is it for our comments for now.
Thanks, Dwight. Appreciate it. So part of the issue that we talk about, and we're all pretty well familiarized with the idea of stigma, and that when somebody gets a diagnosis of a disorder, think about the stigma that might be attached to that diagnosis, and that particularly when you're talking to police officers or you're talking to military personnel, if they're diagnosed with a stigma of the disorder, this puts some impact on them. There are two types. There's a public stigma and there's a self-stigma. Officers who are who are stigmatized by being told that they have a disorder often deal with things within their agencies because of the stigma of the word disorder. And that also has an impact on them from the self standpoint, because they begin to believe the press. They begin to believe, okay, I have this disorder, so I have this problem. But what we're trying to deal with is looking at the perceptions of stigma. That, the public, there's a public stigma when you look at the stereotype negative belief about the group. Oh, this person can't do something. The self stigma goes into negative belief about the self, of the character weakness, incompetence, things of that nature. Sometimes there's a prejudice in the public stigma that, when the public considers somebody is stigmatized by, quote, a disorder, there's a prejudice to that. There's also a prejudice from the self perspective, negative reactions, low self-esteem, low, I can't do anything, often we see ultimately the, what I call the Eeyore effect. I'm no good to nobody type of Eeyore effect. And then discrimination and avoidance, withholding employment. And this really is where it comes for the police officers, because they're concerned. If you think about the police officer and you talk to police officers, one of their, outside of not making it home safe, another aspect that they fear, particularly when they are diagnosed with some type of disorder, is that ultimately their department could ask for their gun and their badge until they're deemed able to go back to work based upon someone. So the departments, when they see the word disorder or hear the word disorder, they immediately fall into some of what we see in the public stigma. And they begin to perhaps think, okay, this person is not ready to be able to go back to work. They shouldn't be back on the job, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if we can begin to modify the terms that we use and not be using the term post-traumatic stress disorder as much, we might be able to help change some of the public stigma to it and some of the self-stigma. We can stop some of the self-talk that goes on. We can stop the stigmatization that the officers are having. Because if you talk to a police officer, 99% of them, they want to get and go. They want to get back on the job. They want to get doing what they need to be doing. They want to be doing their job for the purposes that they did, which is to protect the public in order to, and to be able to get home at night. Often if you talk to police officers, at the end of their shift or at the beginning of their shift, they just talk to each other about, let's get us all home safe tonight. And that's how far they look, by shift. We don't necessarily always think about it in our lives. We don't think about that, but they have to. In the military, it was very often for us, it was just get us through this mission. What's the mission? Tell us what the mission is. Let us accomplish the mission. Let us get back safe from the mission. Then we'll worry about the next day. But mission to mission to mission. Same with the police officers. Each shift. Let me get to the end of the shift safe. Let me get home to my family safe and sound. This next video, I want to show you another video. This next video has to do with a video that was produced for Blue Line Support and for WOI. It was produced by Full Sail with not real actors, but some police officers and then some actors. It's called A Long Ride, and this will give you an idea of what a police officer deals with, not necessarily during their shift. You'll see glimpses of of what happens with their shift. But what happens at the end of the shift? What happens when they go home? And how do they react? Because sometimes we don't think about that. So allow me to share this video with you, and then there'll be a chance for us to discuss this again after this video.
All right, that's enough, boy. Go clean up your rooms and hit the shower. Can't please went to the store and get a few milk.
I can do that.
Thank you. I'll have dinner ready by the time you get back.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. We're at 5531 Magnolia Street, and my daughter is not breathing. Here he is. Sir? Sir? This is our daughter?
Business alarm at 545 Lakefront Avenue, indicating rear main door activation.
I'm not gonna Hey. Hey, I'm talking to you. I'm talking to you.
Relax. No, we're gonna be together for a long time tonight.
When I get out of here, I see you, and we will. That's a promise. What's up, man? I'm trying to move, but trying to get some help. Bye-bye.
Why did you wake it up?
You're all the same. You're all the same.
Officer down! Officer down!
Sit down. What are you doing?
Officer down! Officer down!
I think I'm hit.
Shots fired! Shots fired! My daughter is not breathing. My daughter is not breathing. Sir?
We've been together for a long time.
Time in the days since I've been straight. Wasting away, still I try to fake the things I've come to. Knowing love, I'm expected of. But these damn days, I don't feel the same. It shouldn't be this way. Well, I'm watching the world as it spins around me. I'm such a small rhythm.
So in this, you can see what it's like for the officer as they deal with the day-to-day life that they, you know, as you saw, that this began to impact him off duty. And that not only does it affect him off duty, but it also affects his wife. You noticed how he is hyper alert with everything, and that he drives down the streets and he sees the incidences, the places that he stopped to do various things. He sees the people he's arrested who are making threats to him. I was teaching a course once, and I had a police officer in my course, and I noticed he always brought his purse in, and I kidded him about his purse, and he said, "I don't go anywhere without it." And you can gather in the purse he was carrying his off-duty weapon. And I said to him, because my daughter was getting ready to go to the police academy, and I was talking to him about off-duty weapons, and I said, "Well, why do you carry an off-duty weapon? Is it in case you encounter a situation where you can intervene as an officer?" And he said, "Well, you know, yes, but that's not really the priority reason." He said, and we saw this in the video, he said, "One day, you know, I never carried. When I first got started, I never carried. And, you know, I went on a call, I arrested somebody. It was rather a difficult takedown. There was a fight involved. I finally got him down. I got him arrested. Ultimately, he wound up going to prison for a while." And he said, "But then one day, I was walking through a mall with my family, and I looked across the way, And there was the individual who I had arrested after the fight. And he said, and I didn't have a weapon. He said, I never felt so exposed in my life as that moment. And he said, from then on, I've always carried my off-duty weapon. My daughter, who's a police officer now, works for one of our local agencies. When she first went out on the road, you know, you can imagine, I don't know if any of you have law enforcement personnel in your family, if any of you have children that are law enforcement. It's quite an interesting thing to be a parent of a law enforcement. I can only imagine what the spouses go through, because as a parent, her mother and I, you know, we wanted her to check in every night when she got home, to call us when she got back home. She's a single individual. Sometimes she would stop by our house because we lived close to us. And I could always tell when she stopped by that she had had a tough day by what she didn't say to her mother, but she would say to me when we were private, because she and I have that connection, not only as daughter and father, but she understands that, having seen the dragon, as we called it in the military, and understanding what that felt like, that she could share these things with me. But she was experiencing very traumatic situations. If you ever sat with a law enforcement person, or sometimes a military person, it's, you know, look where they sit, how they sit. It's most often it's with their back to a wall, or at least their face to the door so that they can see the door. When my daughter first became a cop, I always sat facing the door. But when she became a cop, the first time we went out to dinner, I didn't take that into consideration. I sat in my normal place, and I would sit facing the door, and I could see her shifting a lot, anxious, a little anxious, because she couldn't see the door. So from then on, we switched sides, and I figure she's carrying, I'm not at the moment, so let her have that. But this is what they go through, that their shift ends, but the job doesn't. The process doesn't. I know as mental health counselors that sometimes, you know, we go home with you know, pile of stuff that we've heard during the day, and we have our own way of purging it out. You know, these law enforcement people have to find ways to purge it out too, and they do it by different ways, and we'll get into some of that. But before we go any further, I wanted to see if anybody had any questions, comments, wanted to voice it, or anything that we might have before I move on.
All right, so thus far, we have a question and a comment. First, we have a question about the previous video that you played. An attendee would like to know what year that incident happened, the original video that you played.
I'm thinking, I guess now, I think it's like 2016, something in that range.
Okay.
2015, 2016.
And then we have a comment from Diana. I am a crisis intervention counselor of a charter high school, where that hypervigilance is seen in many of these students due to gang-related activities, and some were students at Stoneman Douglas. We have active shooter drills that are mandatory and cause, in my opinion, re-traumatization in these situations, or in these students who survived the school shooting. I also have spoken to our police officers who themselves have some kind of PTSD. As the main counselor in the school of 250 students, where can I find quality resources about the differences between PTS and PTSD?
Excellent question, and I believe I can give you a first start of an answer to that, and that would be that attached to the copy of slides that Aaron is going to send out after this webinar, I've attached the copy of each of these slides that include links to the videos so that you could, if you wanted to watch them again. And also at the end of it, there's several pages of references that you could you can use to go through them. And also, be glad, and I have my phone number and my email address. I'm very open to sharing and talking about this, because, as I said, one of my big goals, aside from the treatment and the care of these officers and anyone who suffers from post-traumatic stress, is to move forward with trying to change some of the verbiage so that we can take some of the stigma out of the disorder aspect of it and move it on to a different point of view. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, Diana has also added, by the way, the cops I talked to say they don't go to therapy because of the stigma you were talking about earlier. They fear of losing their job or being placed behind a desk.
Yes, very, very right on, Diana. And also, what you'll also find is that agencies, depending upon the agency, one of the first lines of defense that the agencies will use when they find someone who's having some of this is that they'll suggest that the individual go to the EAP program that the agency has. The majority of the officers that I have spoken to, and I can't give you a statistical analysis of the number, but I would say, anecdotally, I would say that 90% of the officers that I've spoken to would say, I'm not going to go to EAP, because EAP is paid for by the agency, and therefore, even though they say it's going to be confidential, I don't want the agency to know I'm seeing somebody because I have post-traumatic stress of any kind. So in that vein, they again resist going for treatment. That's part of that is a big reason that Wounded Officers Initiative has sponsored, and we've developed the Blue Line Support Program, because similar as you will find with military personnel will talk to other vets. One vet will talk to another vet, and they'll share things that they experienced. Whereas if you talk to a vet and a family asks them a question, they'll give them some brief answer and move on. As police officers, how is things? Kind of like asking a child when they come home from school, how was school? Okay. The veterans tend to respond that way to non-veterans. Police officers will give that kind of a offhand answer too. Whereas if they are talking to each other, they feel safer talking to each other about their issues than talking to someone else. So Blue Line Support was set up, and there'll be some more discussion of other opportunities, other services available to officers later in the presentation. But it was particularly developed to train police officers how to be peer support officers so that they can support each other in the process. And a police officer, if one of their fellow police officers, not a command officer, but one of their fellow officers says, man, you really need to go, you talk to somebody, there's more of a chance that they're going to do that than if they're told to by their command. And the program, PAPA, which is the New York City Police Department's program, peer support program, has worked very hard with developing and moving along the peer support. And the biggest, when I do our peer support training, the thing that I tell our officers as we do it is our goal is to keep our officers safe, to keep our officers from not committing suicide, because police officers have a high rate of suicide. You've probably heard recently that the New York Police Department has dealt with a number of suicides of late. It's because they don't feel like they've got a way out. Most of you understand how suicide affects, suicidal ideation affects different people, but our goal is to keep the gun out of the mouth of officers and let them know that there is somebody out there that cares about them and will help them. Because as you saw in the video we just saw on the long ride, the police officer, seemed a little bit withdrawn when his wife came up to him and asked him to go to the store. He said, "Sure." What did you see him do? He suited up. That's military term, suiting up, but he suited up in the way of putting on his gun, his belt, or his gun and his badge. He went out there. He was hyper vigilant as he went out there. When he came back, what did he do? He was even less communicative with his spouse. He just went in, picked up a beer, went outside and sat outside by himself. You see officers repeat that process a lot. And concerns that we have is that in order to silence the noise that's going on in their heads, unfortunately, many of them choose the shortcut routes of alcohol, drugs, other addictive behaviors in order to drown out the noise of their post-traumatic stress. Before I move on, any other questions or comments?
There are none. Actually, no, we did get a couple more coming in. Diana has said, "I can see it in their eyes, though they are suffering. I wish there was something that I can do." And Liz added, "I think EAPs should operate like FMLA, where job protection is part of opting to use this service."
Good point.
And Dwight, great video to share the flashbacks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, you really can't, if you look in an officer's eyes at different times, particularly if they're off duty, or, the majority of them are able to just move along and they go about their lives. But, the weight of the work that they do, because let's face it, they see the underbelly. They see so often things that they're the blue line. They're protecting us from seeing some of this. They're protecting us from experiencing some of this. So they're carrying a heavy weight. Not to, and let me just talk, as we're talking about post-traumatic stress, let me just throw out the fact that as mental health counselors, we too can have these issues pop up depending upon the type of practice we have and the people we're dealing with. So it's also, as we're reading this, let's not project out and say, oh, this is a police officers, that's the first responders, these are military personnel. We are also on that front line, and we don't necessarily see the underbelly of the beast, but we certainly can hear a lot about it. So we too need to do our own self-help too, and pay attention to these things. To comment back on the EAP, yeah, it'd be great to get EAP redesignated, but this is going to take a lot of work to get some of this worked out so that we can get it this way. My own personal push is that I'd like us to begin looking at a new paradigm, and this isn't brand new. This has been out for a while, but to look at PTSD and the post-traumatic stress as an injury, and that it is, from the standpoint that it's a biological, physical, and mental injury, but it's also, from a biological standpoint, their responses to the post-traumatic stress is not only a mental response, but it's also a physical response. Think about times that you might have been in crisis, you might have been dealing with certain situations, and not only are you anxious in your head, but your body is also responding with the adrenaline rush, with the cramps, the muscle problems that you might be having, the other issues that you might be having. So it's a biological thing. I remember when I took dance lessons, which I took for a long time, at least I learned to be able to hear the beat. But I can remember my dance instructor constantly saying, David, stop thinking so hard about this. Let the muscle memory do it. Let that work your way through. And when I thought about, the biological impact of post-traumatic stress, I was thinking about the muscle memory. So how do we help an individual who is suffering from post-traumatic stress and find a way that we can address it without calling it a disorder? Now, there are places where it's effective and to call it a disorder, but why not consider using the term post-traumatic stress injury? Because an individual with a post-traumatic stress injury has a different point of view if you say it's an injury as opposed to a disorder. And that the element of injury means that we have a methodology, we have a way of rehabilitating ourselves. If any of you have ever suffered an injury, I broke my ankle skydiving, the one and only time I ever did skydiving. I don't know what the worst part of that was one, either, breaking my ankle and my leg, or the doctor coming in and looking at my chart and saying, really, a man of your age skydiving? I was quite insulted. I'd never thought of my age at that point in time until that moment. But, part of what happened during my skydiving event is that we came in over trees, we came into a situation and into a landing. And even though the instructor had said for me to raise my legs, my left leg obeyed, my right leg went back to my military training that taught me when I jumped out of a helicopter to run like crazy. So I was ready to hit the ground and run. And not so good, particularly coming in that fast and with somebody on my back. It didn't work. But after I went through the surgical procedure to fix myself, I had to go through rehabilitation. And as I went through the rehabilitation, I got stronger, I felt better, I could walk better, a lot of different things happened. So if we could start looking at post-traumatic stress before we consider it a disorder, take a stop and say, maybe this is an injury. Let's look at this from an injury standpoint, and how can we help someone who is dealing with an injury versus post-traumatic stress disorder. So in a moment, I'm going to show you another video. It's more, the pictures are there to provide the visual aspect to you as an individual who wrote an article called Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, or PTSD, Ending the Stigma Starts With Me. And he'll go into it. The name, he's asked his name not to be used. He's written it as an anonymous police officer, and he'll explain why in the video and audio. But I think this gives us something to stop and think about. And then again, like in the last video, I will stop and give us a chance to ask some questions and to respond to some of the comments that are there. So without further ado.
PTSD, Ending the Stigma Starts With Me, from an article posted on lawenforcementtoday.com, written by an anonymous police officer. PTSD, Ending the Stigma Starts With Me. I have PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury. I dropped the D, which stood for disorder, quite some time ago. While many in the medical world still refer to it as a disorder, I do not. Personally, I feel that the term disorder contributes to the negative stigma surrounding the condition. and I suspect that it might serve as an obstacle that prevents many from reaching out for help. To me, the term injury is far more accurate than a disorder. I don't wear my PTSI as a badge of honor, nor am I ashamed of it. Way back in the early days, I was very ashamed, embarrassed, and even felt guilty about my condition. I've since learned that those negative feelings about the condition came very close to costing me my life. I don't speak about it with everyone because, to be totally honest, not everyone has earned the right to hear about it. My story isn't for everyone. I talk about it when I encounter someone who either has a condition or if one of their family members does. I will also speak about it if I feel that my experience will help them. This is one of those times. The sole purpose of writing this is to let everyone know that PTSI is not only survivable, but it is possible to have a very high quality of life. I can tell you the latter part of this is true because I have a very enjoyable life, even with PTSI. Some of you might ask, well, why isn't the author sharing their name? Rest assured, it isn't because I'm ashamed or that I try to keep a secret. The answer is simple. I live a high-profile life and am in the public eye. It is my belief that if I told you my name, it might take the focus off the story and place it on me. Because I want people to read the story, I'm making it not about me. Do I want publicity because of this? No. Do I want someone to feel sorry for me? No. My post-traumatic stress injury was caused by many incidents of extreme violence as a police officer. At this point in the story, many people will go into great detail about the incidents they went through. I will say that I went through 4 officer-involved shootings in a little more than 10 years. Fortunately, everyone survived. This is in addition to the countless murders and traumatic injuries and deaths that most law enforcement officers witnessed during their careers. What happened to explain how we receive our post-traumatic stress injuries should never be a comparison or competition. It is my opinion that the comparison game or thoughts that what I went through wasn't as bad as what someone else experienced is one of the first barriers of breaking down the stigma. I've received much help and understanding from combat military veterans that definitely helped me make the progress that I've achieved. It is also my opinion, from my own experience, that if I'd not gotten help from professionals that were experienced and well-versed in police-related trauma, that my life, if I was still alive, would not be as happy and productive as it is today. I was first diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, which I now call an injury, back in 1989, 30 years ago. I'm not an expert in the treatment of PTSI, but I know several people who are. Trust me when I tell you, there are many effective treatments available today that were not available in the late 80s and early 90s. To look at me, no one would be able to tell that I have PTSI. And better yet, the symptoms don't dominate my life. Back in the early 1990s, it was a very different story. Due to a line of duty injury, which occurred during a violent assault, I was retired on a physical disability pension. The injury led to 3 orthopedic surgeries and a couple steel plates. The assault contributed to my PTSI, but the recovery from the surgeries and adjustments from the injury serves as a template for my recovery from PTSI. In the early days, I had extreme problems sleeping due to nightmares. Another frequent problem was hearing a gunshot right next to my ear as I was falling asleep. The gunshot sound was accompanied by what I can best describe as a violent jolt to my head. I imagine it's similar to the physical effect of a strong electric shock to the head. Drinking alcohol in large amounts on a nightly basis helped knock me out. I was never able to relax. I was in a constant state of physical and mental alertness, ready to fight at any moment. The doctors use the term hypervigilance to describe my state of mind. I was so alert and hypervigilant that many would have said that I was bordering on paranoia. I was either very depressed or extremely rageful. It's difficult to accurately describe how short my fuse had become. Mental health professionals repeatedly called it irritability, which is an understatement. That'd be like calling the Grand Canyon a hole in the ground. I become so hypervigilant and so rageful that I became fearful about leaving my house. Not that I was afraid of other people and possible threats. I was extremely fearful that I might snap on someone and overreact to the slightest provocation. I never did snap, but rarely leaving the house helped ensure that never happened. The term flashbacks is used often, but that was a very rare occurrence for me. If my memory is correct, those only happened to me a few times over the past 30 years. What did happen quite often in the early years is what the doctors called disassociating. Disassociation is described as a mental process of disconnecting from one's thoughts, feelings, memories, or sense of identity. In my case, I would zone out or disassociate and be totally disconnected from everyone and everything around me. The zoning out would occur several times a day. Between the ever-bubbling rage, the disassociating, isolation, and drinking, my marriage began to suffer dramatically, which eventually ended in divorce. Add into all that, my physical health was deteriorating quickly. Even though I was only in my early 30s, I was drinking alcohol heavily and also had a great deal of difficulty eating and sleeping. Eating problems became quite frequent. I would eventually become hungry, but when I started to eat, I would immediately become nauseous. So I learned to adapt by eating a couple bites quickly before the urge to vomit came over me. The other solution was to eat small junk food snacks when I could. Compounding that issue was that the thought of having to rely on anyone, even my wife, for food, made me extremely depressed. I lost about 35 pounds. Of course, I wasn't eating the way I should. Sleep was a real problem. I was drinking excessively, and my personal hygiene began to slip. At that point, my marriage was failing, and the thoughts of suicide became quite frequent. In an attempt to save my marriage, I gave in to a request from my spouse that I seek immediate help. The half measures I've been doing with mental health therapists wasn't working well at all. Both she and I continue to suffer a great deal. I should also state that I was in a state of denial. Not that I had PTSD. I knew that I had it. It was obvious. I was in denial because I was more focused on what and who caused the condition than I was about accepting personal responsibility about making sure I got the help that I needed. Fortunately, I found a treatment center that was only for law enforcement officers. They've since closed. It was there that I got the help that I needed, and I learned that I was responsible for cooperating with and following through with my therapy. I'm responsible for making sure that I complete my therapy and that I make the needed adjustments to have a full and happy life in spite of my PTSI. Here's a comparison. Many of us have suffered line-of-duty orthopedic injuries. I'm no exception. My injury required that I had 3 separate surgeries and then 3 separate long-term periods of physical therapy. Plus, I had to learn how to do things differently as part of my recovery. With the PTSI, it's no different. I'm responsible for seeking the therapy, following through with the therapy, and learning to do things differently because of my post-traumatic stress injury. The good news is that there's a treatment program for law enforcement, first responders, and military veterans at Transformations Treatment Center. Transformations Treatment Center has a world-class treatment program for law enforcement officers, first responders, and military veterans. Transformations Treatment Center provides a comprehensive range of treatments for substance abuse, co-occurring mental health disorders, and PTSD, in addition to multiple rehabilitation and holistic treatments for all those suffering from substance abuse problems. It's a separate program for law enforcement, first responders, and military veterans, where law enforcement, firefighters, veterans, and all first responders receive a separate and highly specialized treatment they deserve. The program features first responders and veterans helping first responders and veterans. Call 888-991-9725. That's 888-991-9725. One of the other problems, due to the stigma associated with these traumas and conditions, is that many law enforcement officers, either active or retired, won't reach out and speak to anyone. Even though many great peer support options are available through their departments, I totally understand that many don't trust any group that is associated with their agency due to possible reporting concerns. Therefore, I highly recommend Blue Line support from the Wounded Officers Initiative. Their number is 855-WOI-BLUE. That's 855-964-2583. For most of the past 30 years, I've lived in a state that I would describe as symptom-free, where the PTSI doesn't dominate my life. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm back to being the old guy that I was before those incidents. It means I have a happy, productive life. I can do what I want and travel where I want. However, I'm responsible for following through with treatment, which consists of doing the things that I was taught to make my PTSI manageable. I have to be self-aware and had to learn to do things differently. Just like the orthopedic injury I told you about earlier. I can't do everything with that limb that I used to, but I can do a lot, and most people won't even see the injury. For those who are struggling with PTSI, substance abuse, and or other co-occurring mental health disorders, make the call. And remember, ending the stigma starts.
Ending the stigma starts with the individual officer. They need to be willing to come forward. But as he was sharing, it had to start with him. He had to start, and he had to start with a different way of looking at his condition. Aaron, do we have any questions or comments?
Yes, we do. We have a few. Now, some of the questions and comments date back to continuing on about the EAP issue.
Okay.
I can circle back to those in a moment and maybe stick with anything from the current video, but actually it looks like the comments really predate the video. So I can go back to the EAP issue. Dwight said that he totally agrees that EAP is underused. He thinks it's underused because it's not trusted, and without trust, an officer doesn't feel safe to open up. He adds that peer support is valuable and wonders if LMHCs offer the same support as police, fire, and medical, as it takes a struggler to help a fellow struggler. And one thing I was a little confused about myself is I do some EAP work here in my area with police officers and with corrections deputies and with firefighters. And there are like two scenarios with EAP referrals. There are mandatory EAP referrals, which would be a minority of the clients I see. And then there are voluntary EAP referrals. And I thought the only thing that the EAP company was permitted to disclose to the employer, meaning the police department or fire department, was minimal information, like even in a mandatory referral, it would be, is the person participating? Are they showing up? Are they complying with recommendations? And those are the only things they're allowed to share. They're not allowed to give any content from the sessions or diagnoses or things like that. So I was curious, is it really that that employers, meaning the police departments and fire departments, are accessing a lot of information about the officers, or is it more sort of a myth, a fear that they would be accessing that information? I was wondering what people's experience are in that area.
Good question. Well, I think it's a little of both. I think that the office, we try to share with them as we're doing the peer support training the value of EAPs. But I think the issue that the officers have, as soon as I say that, they like jump. And it's kind of interesting to watch how quickly they'll jump. And the concern they have is it doesn't matter whether or not their information of their treatment is being shared, because most of them would understand that, you know, there is some client counselor confidentiality. What they're concerned about is that their name is going to show up on a list. And in the peer support that Blue Line has set up, their names, the only place their name shows up is when the client, when the PSO, the peer support officer, submits a report. They submit it electronically, and that report comes to me and me alone. And when we make the referral to the mental health counselor, we give them a code number to report back to us. And the reason that they need to report back to Blue Line is that Blue Line support Wounded Officers Initiative covers the co-pays for the officers. So we want to at least be able to identify not who the officer is, but be able to know, so that the mental health counselors can submit their invoice to us. So we have a code number that associates to something we know has been reported. But the concern that we find with the officers with the EAP is more that their name is going to show up somewhere. And the rest of it, the myth is there, the feedback that they get from other people is there, but it's being found out. Oh, they're going to see a psychologist. They're going to go see, as I'll put it, they're going to see the shrink. They don't want to do it.
And if the officer goes through their insurance rather than EAP, then does any information end up being sent to the employer? Probably not in that scenario.
No, because it's their own insurance. It's going just as you go to your physicians for treatment. It'd be the same thing as a private pay or an insurance pay versus EAP.
So that could become one angle to help use to alleviate that concern, maybe. We have some other comments and questions. Diana says, yes, working with teenagers, their brains are not fully developed and they are already going through so much pressure and misunderstanding from the adults around them, especially those who come from adverse childhood experiences. Many in our school systems do not understand that a lot of angry or self-injurious students come from PTS/D. And Diana adds that she appreciates everything that she's learning here, just wants to know if there will be resources for the civilian who suffers from PTSI, especially adolescents/children. She said, I guess I should wait until the end and see if that question will be answered.
Well, I appreciate that, Diana. And I would hope that, again, part of the purpose of this, I'm using the subject pool in this discussion of police officers, but this is, I think you can take this also into the realm of individuals. And yes, I think students, children, adolescents, and adults who live in areas that they have to crawl under the window in order to feel safe. And that's obviously going to cause some post-traumatic stress to them. But note that the terminology I'm trying to use is post-traumatic stress injury. It's creating a post-traumatic injury in them as opposed to the disorder. It's sort of like someone described disorders to me in this way, in that it's one thing to have in post-traumatic stress is like a bird flying on the top of your head, and it kind of scratches around and then flies away. That's post-traumatic stress. That could be post-traumatic stress injury, those areas. But it's when that bird flies onto my head and it sits there and it starts to build a nest. Now we're beginning to move into the disorder. And if we allow that nest, as it starts to build, if we work at it from an injury standpoint and help the individual, whether it be an officer or a civilian, to deal with their post-traumatic stress, then we won't allow that bird to finish its nest. But if we let that nest take hold, and then they build another nest next to it, and it builds on and builds on, now you've got a big problem. That's where you get into the disorder. In my mind, that's where you get to the disorder. But I think that we jump from critical incident situation / post-traumatic stress and incident to a disorder without something in the middle, which is more of an injury.
We also have Dwight commented that the current video was very powerful, and he added HIPAA requirements are clear. The EAP cannot share information, but first responders don't trust the process, and he agrees it's probably more a fear or myth-based. And Demena adds, how can a therapist in South Florida be able to assist first responders through the EAP program? Or she asks that question.
I'd have to have more in order, first, I strongly recommend that whoever needs that help seeks that help, whether it's through their EAP or through a peer support program. People in South Florida have access to the peer support of Blue Line Support. There's some other organizations out there that can provide them with some support also. In the reference list that I provide, there are some other locations. You'll see UCF Restore is listed as another place for some help. It's very interesting when you look at it that a lot of what we're finding in the data as they're collecting data is these resiliency programs, and I may touch on it in our program today. Resiliency programs are helpful, helping these officers to get through the experience, find ways using virtual reality or other types of methodologies to work their way through the experience. It's often like we try to help our clients to do imagination, try to vision this and approach it from this standpoint, and then to be able to learn to breathe better when they're subjected to that type of thing. Again, that goes back, I mentioned breathe better. That's a biological response. So how do we rehab the individuals with these injuries? But Deanna, I'll be glad to share with you more after this webinar in any way I can to help, because we want to help officers anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world to be
I suppose another thing to add in would be to make sure that to maybe find out what the EAP programs are that the various law enforcement agencies or other employers that you're interested in helping with. What EAPs do they use, and are you a provider on that EAP plan? And that could be a good thing to do. But it looks like we've got a little bit of clarification from Demena, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, by the way. But it's, what is a great intervention that helps to disarm the first responders' paranoia about being found out?
That's an interesting question. I personally believe that it has to come from the command staff. It has to be, in working with police agencies. In fact, next week I'm addressing a group of police chiefs, and I've done this on several occasions, different groups, is to get the police chiefs and the upper command to buy into the value of the EAP and peer support, not as okay, this person's having a problem, we're going to send them there, therefore we can check that off our list of we've taken those steps in the 5-step disciplinary process or whatever it might be. But to look at EAPs and peer support organizations as helping the individual to get better, and to also continue from the top down in the organization to assure the officers that their name, rank, serial number, any identifying information does not come back to the command in any way. And they need, the more that the command staff can support that, the better. And it's not just the command staff, because we've found that we're getting more and more buy-in by the chiefs and many of the officers, the lieutenants, the captains and things, but it's those middle line, the sergeants and some of these other people have to also buy into this, because when an officer is having a problem, their first place of defense, their first place to go to is usually their sergeant or wherever their unit individual is, not to the chief, not to the lieutenant, but to somebody there. So for our work, we're working with police agencies and first responder agencies, is to continue to support the confidentiality that is involved in the EAP and try to knock down that stigma. Talk about stigma. EAP has a stigma of its own to the law enforcement personnel. Again, and in the peer support part of the peer support training is we talk about how important it is to maintain confidentiality, because all you got to do is blow it once and it ripples right through an agency like water on a duck's back. I had to clean that one up. But.
Yeah. There is one more comment, and then I think that is it for now for comments. But Dwight had said a little bit earlier, some first responders private pay to be outside the process. However, EAP is already an employee benefit, which is frequently underutilized. And I know you've already addressed that issue.
Yes, and sometimes officers are willing to do private pay because they don't want anybody to know. Therefore, if they have control, nobody else is going to know about it. But I think it's important for us to continue to educate them on the value of their EAP, that it is a benefit, that it isn't going to cost them anything, and that they're not going to be found out. But you got to get past that prejudice that they have towards the stigma of going to EAP, to use the terms we've already used today. So moving on, and I'll get back towards the end of this, we'll have a little more time to chat, but I am noticing our time is ebbing away. One of the differences that we see in looking at PTSI treatment, assessment and treatment, also PTSD in post-traumatic stress, is that your law enforcement personnel seem to have external triggers more so than military. Military personnel often have internal triggers. With the military personnel, internal triggers being memories, more of the memories. That's, to use myself as an example, certain sounds of certain helicopters set the hair on the back of my neck stands up. Certain sounds, certain smells, but it's all from an internal standpoint because it's hitting my memory triggers. Whereas in law enforcement, as you saw in the earlier video of the long ride, their triggers very often, although some of them are internal, but very often they're external triggers. They're things that they see day in and day out. They drive by the same location. As you recall, in the video, he saw the street sign, the crossway sign, and he remembered what happened at that location. These external symptoms, different than military personnel who, yes, they come back, they have, the difference I found between, Vietnam era veterans who are dealing with their post-traumatic stress and Dwayne, you could probably speak even better to this because you've worked more with the Afghans and Iraq vets. But the Afghan and Iraq vets that I've dealt with, very often what they're dealing with is the things in the road. They may see things in the road that'll trigger them because they always were looking out for IEDs. Whereas in the law enforcement folks, they're seeing their triggers all the time. Driving by certain things, seeing it. So as we consider our treatment regimens for each of them, each of the two different populations, we need to take into consideration that there may be different triggers due to the population. Another interesting, issue that might be result is many of our law enforcement personnel are also former military personnel. So they're doubling up on their triggers. Again, something to take into consideration. As we look at the critical incident stress, it's a response to a traumatic event, obviously. Data is showing us about 85% of law enforcement personnel, and they prefer not to be called LEOs. I used the term LEOs once to somebody, and he says, "I'm not a lion. I'm an LEO." But our law enforcement, so remember, as we work with these folks, that our language needs to be something that's also helpful to them. But we find that 85% of our law enforcement personnel are ultimately exposed to traumatic events, and more than one, continuous. My daughter, I would use her as an example. and she's been on the job about 6 years. Some of the things that my little girl, I just can't imagine this. You know, I could never imagine her going through this, but she does. You know, the things that she's seen, the things that she's had to do are extremely traumatic to her. She told me a story of twice that she's had to put her finger in a wound to try to stop the bleeding until the paramedics could arrive, because somebody that she responded to had a bullet wound. That the number of overdoses that they're using Narcan now to bring them back. You know, these are exposures of traumatic events. And then you pile on the personal experiences of seeing children who are traumatized or injured, and then going home and seeing your own children, or seeing nieces and nephews. These are all things that compound the stress situation that individuals might have. So we know, most of us have some background and experience in assessing post-traumatic stress. The exposure to traumatic experience, and or it may not be something we might think is traumatic, but someone else might think, from the point of view, might be they just buried it and not remembered it. They just go on with their lives because this is what happens to me every day. I'm exposed to traumatic events almost every day. So it's just, business as usual. Briefly to use my own experience during the military experience in the Middle East, we were, the alarms went off and we had to get into our nuclear protection garb and chemical protection garb. Totally forgot about that situation, totally forgot that experience. 20 some years later, I was reading Tom Clancy's The Sum of All Fears. And in it, he wrote about, it was about the Middle East, and he wrote about the Israelis had loaded a nuclear weapon upon one of their planes. And the memory of that experience came flashing back to me like a bolt of lightning. I totally blocked it out because it was just, in the military, you're exposed to things, you just do what you need to do and you move on. So it may not be an event that has just happened. It could be an event that's been buried for a long time. So we need to be looking at that and be assessing the different things. The depression, the irritability, survival guilt is a big one that you find in both military and in law enforcement. Recurring nightmares, flashbacks to the event, the hyper reaction to things, like the overreaction to sudden noises. Something to be aware of as you do your assessments, asking these questions. So when you look at PTSI has the same symptoms as PTS, but they last longer. They're more intense. They involve more, you may begin seeing troubled relationships, as the anonymous officer mentioned in his presentation on stress injury. The alcohol abuse, compulsive behaviors of, steroid abuse, eating disorders, gambling, sexual addiction, you name it, and it plays out. And you talk to someone, how you doing? Oh, I got it under control. Yeah, well, they need to pay attention. And then seeing the depression that seeps in there and goes around that. If you recall the long ride video, you see the fellow, we probably could, all of us look at it and look at that video and say, I wonder if he has some, issues of depression there. We obviously saw that, he appeared to be somewhat depressed, but is that there? What are some of the other things that he has going on? Having a beer or two, or, is not a bad thing. But if it becomes, that's how they get home and that's what they do, is drink to the point like the person in the anonymous officer, drank till he couldn't think about it anymore. It numbs. That's what they're looking for, is to numb the noise. Sometimes I'll ask them, well, what do you do when you get home? Do you turn on the TV? Do you turn on the radio? Do you turn on what do you do? And I find that often they'll say, I turn this on or that on because I don't want to, the quiet is where it's too quiet. So I have to have these things. So as you look at the whole situation, it's a progressive of severity. But first it starts with post-traumatic stress, then it moves into the injury. And then if we don't do something at that injury, then it becomes a disability. That, in my mind, in looking at this from that perspective, it would be like I broke my ankle. Had I not done anything about that injury, I would have been disabled. Ultimately, the bone would have healed itself back together again, but it never would have been the same again. I never would have been able to walk correctly. So you have to address the injury and then consider, is it going to move towards a disability or a disorder itself? So looking at the assessment, and I realize from the poll, some of this is going to be a little more redundant to you and not as interesting, but, PTSI, the physical symptoms of, headaches, muscle aches, different eating patterns, sleeping patterns, low energy and fatigue. If you're looking from the physical standpoint, and these are just very quickly going over some of these, looking at it from the emotional, the denial of, and avoiding the feelings associated with the trauma, sadness, feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, feeling of anxiety and agitation. I'm sure, Dwayne, you've had some experience with the Pulse folks as I did. And the officers there, and some of them will talk about the experience. One of the things I've heard from a number of them is, I've seen dead bodies before, but I've never seen that many in one place. Okay. Sometimes you want to just leave it at that. Sometimes, depending on the other symptomology, you want to unpack that a little bit and work with them. Are they feeling helpless? Are they feeling hopeless? Are they anxious and agitated? Then looking at the cognitive, some of the stuff we were talking about earlier about the stigma, poor self-image, low self-esteem, exaggerated experiences of failures. Okay, I screwed up here. I'm dealing with this, and this is just, I've always been a failure. Again, the Eeyore complex, I'm never doing anything right. Self-blame and guilt, pessimism about the future. That's a thing that we need to watch with our first responders, is because by nature of the type of work, they can become very pessimistic. They can see the world as, as screwed up as they see the world. But really, the idea is that there is a lot of sunshine out there, and they're just seeing the lowest part that of the population. And one of the things that during the anonymous officers presentation, why I had different pictures, is because sometimes we see officers as oppressors, but they're also good people. I remember growing up, the officer was always somebody to respect. They were good. You wanted to, people wanted to become police officers. They wanted to have that position to help other people. Now police agencies are having a terrible time recruiting new officers. Why? Maybe it's the public's response to police officers as a whole, the way police officers are depicted, the way, in some ways the media is depicting the law enforcement people. We really need to be cognizant of how this is being impacted, how officers are being impacted by the negative way that they're being looked at. So of course they're going to be pessimistic. And they look at each other, it's us against them. When I was in the military, it was us and the civilian world. And there was a significant difference in how we thought about those two dynamics. In law enforcement, they also have that dynamic. So when you're looking at the behavioral symptoms, looking at these things, I tried to pick some pictures that would correspond to this. The behavioral is, passive, little motivation. If some of you didn't understand who I was talking about, Eeyore, maybe this picture would help you with Winnie the Pooh and Eeyore. Poor grooming habits. You heard the the anonymous officer talk about the fact that he had little motivation. He also, got into poor grooming habits, lethargic behavior, using the sleepy dwarf as that one. Somewhat they get very expressionless. They don't show a lot of emotion at all. I remember when I was training in the military to be a medic. I was a medic in the military. That one of the first lessons they taught us was to be expressionless. And law enforcement personnel they're also trained that way. You don't want the people to see your expression per se. You want to hold it. You want to have a neutral expression. For us and as medics, they kept telling us, imagine the wound, somebody, and you don't want, the guy's laying there, and you don't want to have that, oh my goodness, look on your face. You want to be able to provide that support. You want to be able to say, you're okay. I'm here with you. I've got you. Okay. Now, as far as you okay, you got to be careful with that term, but hey, I got you. You're not alone. I got you. I'm going to do everything I can to help you, instead of giving false platitudes like, you're going to be fine. Don't worry about it. Not necessarily. And again, the other behavioral symptom you might see is indecision and poor concentration. As our anonymous officer talked about, his disassociation, his inability to make decisions. These are things that you begin to see in individuals. So how do you treat this? You provide, how do you treat post-traumatic stress injury? Similar, provide support, provide reassurance, reduce the avoidances, of them trying to get away. Reframe how the officer looks at his or her experience, reframe how the officer reacts to the triggers. And that's where the resiliency training comes in. It helps with these two areas particularly. And this is where we as mental health counselors can help people to, overcome their post-traumatic stress. With the injury, it's the same as post-traumatic stress, but look at, the mental health wellness. What we found, the statistics of some of the data that you'll see in my reference pages is, providing individuals with wellness resources where they can find mental health wellness. In law enforcement, annual in-services training on mental wellness. One of the things that a local agency here just asked us to do, and we went in and spoke to all new supervisors in the police department to prepare them and provide them insight in what to look for, so that they can help their officers before it becomes too far down the line. Use this resiliency building and training to help them to get beyond this thing that they're dealing with. The post-traumatic stress events that are causing them to freeze, to respond in certain ways. Provide external supports such as CISMs, the crisis intervention support. Dwight's, I'm going to give you a little plug here. Dwight is doing a workshop before our annual conference in February on crisis intervention. If you're interested in this field, I certainly would recommend that you attend that program. Dwight, I'm planning to come. Get your people involved in peer support and mental health services, and we find that this is something that peer support seems to help. And then chaplain support. In fact, in Blue Line support, in our peer support officer teams, we have several chaplains, because not only are they dealing with the traumatic issues, but they also may be involved in having some spiritual emergencies, because what they see, how, from a spiritual standpoint, could this be true? How could my spirituality stand up to this type of thing? Whereas our spirituality should help us to progress through this. So we want to help them, and helping our chaplains to help them through the spiritual emergencies that they have. Post-traumatic stress disorder, it's the same treatments as the PTS and PTSI, but it's more long-term. It may involve, in some cases, inpatient care. It may involve other types of ways to mediate the disorder. But in my mind, the disorder needs to be the last of that string of post-traumatic stress. So in somewhat closing, I really think we need to develop a new language. I think we need to call this condition post-traumatic stress injury, if it progresses beyond that post-traumatic stress. Now it's beginning to, that bird is starting to build its nest. That's a post-traumatic stress injury. So let's call it that and not just go to the place where that bird has built its nest and now it's building its second story to the nest, but we're catching it ahead of time. So by using the new language within our care community, us and other medical personnel, to change it within the first responder agencies and the language, and to change it in the media and in the public. We need to begin, if we believe the fact that this is a post-traumatic stress injury caused by a stressful situation, and it's an injury that can be treated, that can be rehabilitated through various steps before it becomes a disorder and it sets itself in. I think that if we change the language, we may have more officers, more individuals who are suffering from post-traumatic stress injuries come forward, because they're going to avoid the stigma that is associated with having a disorder. So with this, open it up to any questions that individuals might have.
All right. Well, I know we have a question and some comments and resources. A question we have from Diana is there a PTS/I/D assessment like we have for suicide, and in parentheses CSSR? I just came back into the field after a 5-year hiatus, so I'm trying to catch up.
Well, first of all, Dan, thank you for changing even through this workshop, you've changed your language from PTSD to PDS, PDSI, PTSD. Thank you. That's step number one. That's the first one. Is there a particular resource? Right off the top of my head, I'm not sure that there is a checklist to look at specifically. Perhaps
I can offer one. I can offer a couple resources that might be helpful for folks. If you go to dsm5.org, that's DSM, the number 5.org, and then you click on online assessment measures on the right-hand side, you can access the DSM-5 cross-cutting symptom measures, and you'll see that there is a measure for PTSD, including one for children and adolescents on that site. I can't remember if it's the disorder-specific severity specifier section or if it's the cross-cutting symptom measure section, but it'll be there. Another resource is if you were to just Google SAMHSA screening tools, that's SAMHSA for Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, then you'll get to a site that has different categories, including trauma, with some different assessments and screening tools that you can use for post-traumatic stress.
Thank you, Aaron. Unfortunately, there doesn't have one for injury yet, but therein lays the opportunity for us to do some research, collegially, and perhaps come up with an assessment tool just for that.
Absolutely. Dwight says, Pulse created elevated trauma from exposure to 49 bodies in bloody water. A water pipe shattered when SWAT broke through the wall to subdue the assailant. Greater the sensory exposure equals greater trauma. Smell is number one, then sight, sound, touch, and taste. And he also let us know about, as far as that training goes, it will be at the FOMCA pre-conference. It's complex grief certification. It's the most powerful training he's ever attended. So he went to San Diego to get certified as an instructor, and it will be at the FOMCA pre-conference in February. It's guaranteed to sell out. And so you may want to go to fomca.org in order to access that tool. Dwight also says, helpful information and webinar. Thanks, David and Aaron. And he also talked about dsm5.org and the online assessment measures. Okay, Dwight, good to know we're on the same page. Lindsay says post-traumatic stress assessments include the PCL-5 and the CAPS. I know the PCL-5 is one of the tools that you will find on those resources we gave earlier, but I'm not sure if the CAPS is there. Diana has asked if we can post or email those resources. What I will do, Diana, is for everybody that does the evaluation form, I will include not only the handouts for today in a follow-up email, but you'll also get a link to those assessments. And then Lindsay also said PCL-5 is a screener while CAPS is a manualized diagnostic interview. Okay, great. Maybe I'll try to include the CAPS in that follow-up email as well. And I believe that that is all that we have so far with questions and comments. We'll give you a little bit of wrap-up information in a moment here. Before we do that, David, do you have any parting thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, I appreciate everybody's attendance to this. It is a very important area. It's something that we need to be paying attention for, not only our police officers, but our firefighters and those who are often forgotten, the first responders, the ambulance drivers, and the people who are putting them into the ambulances and seeing this. The individuals who respond to the automobile accidents and have to cart the cars away. You know, it's a ripple effect. And then, of course, and this is why WOI and Blue Line Support has opened up its resources now to the 911 and the dispatchers, and also to the crime scene techs, because it doesn't just impact the first responders, it impacts the support people. It also impacts the family. And I think that's a key fact, as you saw in the movie of The Long Ride. You know, the wife with that look to her husband, she knows to a degree what he's going through, but no one really does know for sure. You know, just a quick comment. You know, years ago during the Gulf War I woke up in the morning and my wife and I were going about what we were doing, and she said, you really had you were screaming a lot during the night. You were fighting and screaming. What was going on? And I said, for a moment I just hesitated, and then I said, I had one of my dreams again. And she said, well, that's silly. And when she said that, I physically felt myself close down. And I mean close down tight. And I went about the rest of our day. We didn't talk to each other. I didn't want to talk to her, for sure. And it wasn't until that evening that we were in the kitchen preparing dinner, and I murmured under my breath, it's not silly. And she said, but it was so long ago. And I said, that's why it's not silly. My point being that post-traumatic stress doesn't just happen right at the moment, and the reactions to post-traumatic stress are not just situational, but can be ongoing and can be a result. You know, how many of us have done therapy where we've gone back into people's past and we find that there was a particular critical incident that happened somewhere in their life that really built on how they built the rest of their life. So I think it's important for us to be aware of it. Please, if you got nothing else out of this workshop, try starting to use a different language. Don't always go to the D. You know, that's why this workshop is called To D or Not to D. You know, to D or not to D, that's the question. Let's not jump to the D. Let's drop into the I first. Don't let that bird build its nest. Keep that nest from growing by talking about injury. You'll get better. I think you'll get better response from those who aren't looking to be disabled, not looking to have a disorder, but are looking to recover from their injury. Thank you again for your time, and enjoy your weekend since it is Friday.
Thank you so much. And so I'd also like to remind everybody that to please complete that webinar evaluation form, which is going to appear on your screen in just a few moments here after I'm done talking. And if you miss it, you'll have a second chance. You'll get an email in about 1 hour that will have a link to it. And you'll want to make sure that you complete that today, because tonight we're going to be reporting your attendance into CE Broker. We also hope that you'll join us for our next webinar as part of our 2019 Emerging Issues in Mental Health Counseling webinar series. The next one's entitled Mindful Strategies for Counselors on Friday, October 25th from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And that one will be with Jackie Small-Darville, who's a certified school counselor, a mindfulness instructor, and a life coach. And if you're interested in registering for the pre-conference workshop on grief counseling with Dwight Bain, you can visit fmca.org, fmhca.org, and then you can click on conference and then pre-conference workshops to get more information and to register. Well, thank you, David, so much for a very interesting and meaningful and impactful presentation today. We appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise and your information. I hope everyone found it as helpful as I did. And we will wish you all a very happy and meaningful weekend.